In 1941, the German war machine seemed unstoppable. Nation after nation had fallen to the Blitzkrieg. As the Panzers rolled south into the Balkans, they expected the small nation of Greece to surrender without a fight. Instead, they ran into a wall of concrete, steel, and mountains, manned by soldiers who had decided this was the place they would die. This is the story of the Metaxas Line, one of the most heroic and forgotten last stands of the Second World War. If you believe in the power of defiance against impossible odds, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible military history. What is the most heroic last stand you've ever heard of? Let us know in the comments below. Now, to the mountains of Greece. April 6th, 1941. The Rupel Pass. Greco-Bulgarian border. At 05:15 in the morning, the pre-dawn silence of the rugged Balasica Mountains was shattered by the thunder of hundreds of German artillery pieces and the scream of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers. This was the opening salvo of Operation Marita, the German invasion of Greece. For the Führer, this was a frustrating but necessary diversion. His primary focus was the impending invasion of the Soviet Union, but the failed Italian invasion of Greece the previous year had created an unstable southern flank and brought British troops onto the European mainland. The German 12th Army, a veteran force of 500,000 men and over 800 tanks, was tasked with a simple, brutal objective: crush all resistance, secure Greece, and do it with maximum speed. The German planners expected the campaign to be a textbook blitzkrieg, lasting no more than a few weeks. They had completely underestimated what was waiting for them in the mountains. Waiting for them was not a disorganized Balkan army, but one of the most formidable and least known fortress systems in the world, the Metaxas Line. Named after the Greek dictator Ioannis Metaxas, who had commissioned its construction in the 1930s, this was not a simple line of trenches. It was a 125-mile-long chain of 21 independent subterranean fortress complexes, a concrete wall built to be the northern shield of Greece. Drawing inspiration from the French Maginot Line, Greek engineers had designed a system perfectly adapted to the mountainous terrain. Instead of a continuous wall, the Metaxas Line was a series of mutually supporting forts, dug deep into the rock of the mountains themselves. Each fort was a self-contained underground city, with barracks, command posts, infirmaries, and ammunition depots all housed in shell-proof tunnels, some running for several kilometers. The fighting positions were masterpieces of camouflage and engineering. Artillery casemates were built to be invisible from the air and the ground, their guns firing from camouflaged embrasures that offered interlocking fields of fire across the valleys and passes. Machine gun nests were housed in concrete pillboxes with walls over 2 meters thick, their firing slits the only clue to their existence. The defenders of this line were not the cream of the Greek army. The best Greek divisions were still fighting in Albania, having just spent 6 months successfully repelling Mussolini's invasion and pushing the Italian army back deep into Albanian territory. The men holding the Metaxas Line were a mixture of regular infantry divisions, border guards, and hastily mobilized reservists from the local population, commanded by General Konstantinos Bakopoulos. They were exhausted from the long war with Italy, and they were desperately short of modern anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons. What they possessed, however, was an intimate knowledge of the terrain and an iron-willed determination to defend their homeland. They had watched the Germans conquer Europe, and they harbored no illusions about the odds. They were prepared to fight and die where they stood. The German plan of attack was sophisticated, designed by generals who were masters of mountain warfare. The main thrust was to be carried out by the elite 17th Mountain Corps, Gebirgskorps, composed of the 5th and 6th Mountain Divisions. These were the Gebirgsjäger, specialist light infantry who had proven their worth in the mountains of Norway. Their mission was not to smash their heads against the front of the forts. Instead, they would use their mountaineering skills to infiltrate the rugged, snow-covered terrain between the main fortresses, bypass the frontal defenses, and attack the forts from the rear and flanks where they were most vulnerable. Meanwhile, Other infantry divisions, like the 125th Infantry Regiment, would launch direct frontal assaults to fix the defenders in place. The focal point of the entire operation was Fort Rupel, the largest and most powerful complex in the line, which guarded the strategic Rupel Pass, the main gateway into Greece. The German command believed that by isolating and surrounding the forts, the defenders, seeing themselves cut off, would quickly surrender. It was a logical plan based on a complete failure to understand the psychology of their opponent. The assault began on the morning of April 6th. Following the terrifying aerial bombardment by the Stukas, the German artillery opened fire. Then, the infantry advanced. The soldiers of the German 125th Infantry Regiment, advancing towards Fort Rupel, expected to find the defenders stunned and demoralized. Instead, the moment they entered the pre-registered killing zones, the mountainside erupted in a storm of fire. From dozens of perfectly camouflaged and seemingly invisible positions, Greek machine guns and artillery opened up. The German assault waves were torn apart. The accuracy of the Greek fire was phenomenal, the result of years of preparation. Every gully, every path, every depression in the landscape was already zeroed in. The initial German attack faltered, then broke, the survivors scrambling for cover, leaving hundreds of their comrades dead and wounded in the valley. The Germans were stunned. This was not the kind of resistance they had encountered anywhere else in Europe. At the same time, the elite Gebirgsjäger began their difficult infiltration through the mountains. Weighed down by heavy equipment, they struggled through deep snow and treacherous terrain that was not marked on their maps. They were harassed by Greek patrols and picked off by snipers who knew every rock and crevice. The plan to quickly bypass the forts was already falling behind schedule. As the day wore on, the Germans renewed their frontal assaults, this time with direct fire support from 80 mm anti-aircraft guns used in a ground roll. They blasted away at the concrete pillboxes at point-blank range. But the Greek fortifications were built to withstand a direct hit from a 220mm shell. The 80mm rounds, while terrifying, simply chipped away at the thick concrete walls. Inside, the Greek defenders, though shaken, continued to man their guns and scythe down any German troops who tried to advance. One of the most dramatic actions of the first day took place at Fort Istanbul. After repeated frontal assaults failed with heavy losses, German combat engineers, Pioniere, managed to crawl up to the main fortification under the cover of smoke and intense supporting fire. They placed massive explosive charges against the steel cupolas of the machine gun posts and detonated them. The explosions were immense, yet when the smoke cleared, the guns inside opened fire again. Frustrated and enraged, the Germans then climbed onto the roof of the fortress itself and began pouring gasoline and explosives down the ventilation shafts, turning the underground tunnels into a fiery inferno. Still, the Greeks refused to surrender. They sealed off the burning sections of the fort and continued to fight from other positions. The story was the same all along the line. At Fort Nymphaea, the defenders held out against overwhelming attacks for 3 days. The Germans, in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate, brought up railway guns and bombarded the fort, but could not force a surrender. The psychological impact on the German soldiers was profound. They were the victors of Europe, the masters of the Blitzkrieg. They were accustomed to seeing their enemies break and flee before them. Here, they were faced with an enemy who seemed to have no instinct for self-preservation, who fought for every pillbox and every trench with a suicidal ferocity. The Greeks were not just defending a line, they were defending their homes. For many of the reservists in the forts, the villages being shelled by the Germans in the valleys below were the places they were born. This was not a political or ideological battle, it was a deeply personal one. As the second day of the invasion, April 7th, dawned, the German command was in a state of frustrated disbelief. A timetable that had allotted hours for the capture of the Metaxas Line was now stretching into days, and the casualty reports were climbing at an alarming rate. The pride of the Wehrmacht, particularly the elite Gebirgsjäger, had been bloodied and held at bay by a supposedly second-rate army. The response was an escalation of brute force, a decision to pulverize the fortresses that they could not outmaneuver. The focus of this fury was Fort Rupel. The Luftwaffe was unleashed in continuous waves. Stuka dive bombers, the flying terror of the Blitzkrieg, screamed down upon the fort's surface positions. Their bombs blasted away the camouflage, cratered the mountainside, and smashed several of the surface-level machine gun posts. But the core of the fortress, the underground tunnels, the deep artillery casemates, the command centers buried under dozens of feet of rock and concrete, remained untouched. For the Greek defenders inside the mountain, the experience was a living hell. The constant, thunderous impacts of bombs and heavy shells turned their subterranean world into a vibrating, dust-filled cacophony. Concrete dust filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. The noise was so intense that it caused nosebleeds and concussions even deep within the tunnels. Yet, through this apocalyptic bombardment, the defense remained organized and lethal. Greek officers moved through the tunnels, directing ammunition to the guns that were still firing and dispatching medical teams to the wounded. The artillery pieces, safe in their rock-hewn casemates, continued their deadly work. Their gunners, unable to see the battlefield, relied on forward observers who would peer from camouflaged steel cupolas, call down fire missions over the field telephone system, and then duck back down an instant before the position was inevitably targeted. It was a deadly, heroic cycle that was repeated all along the line. The Germans, realizing that bombardment alone would not work, sent their Sturmpioniere forward again. These elite combat engineers were masters of demolition. Braving the storm of fire, they reached the outer walls of several forts. They used new revolutionary technology, shaped charges. These were explosive devices designed to focus the blast into a narrow, penetrating jet, capable of punching through steel and concrete. They placed them on the armored observation cupolas and artillery embrasures, blasting holes in the fortress's outer skin. In several instances, they managed to get onto the roofs of the pillboxes and drop grenades and incendiary charges down the periscopes and ventilation shafts. The fighting became a desperate, close-quarters struggle for every firing port and every entrance. In one tunnel at Fort Rupel, a German flamethrower team managed to shoot a jet of burning liquid fuel through a firing slit, turning the interior of the pillbox into an inferno. The Greek machine gun crew inside was killed instantly, but within minutes, another team had crawled through the connecting tunnels, removed their dead comrades, and brought the gun back into action. This unbreakable spirit was the Germans' true opponent. They were fighting an enemy for whom surrender was not an option. At Fort Aquinos, after 2 days of relentless assault, the German commander sent a captured Greek officer under a white flag to demand the fort's surrender. The Greek commander, Major Ioannis Paparodou, sent back a simple, defiant reply that would become legendary. Forts are not surrendered, they are taken. He and his men continued to fight until they were all killed or wounded. This was the spirit of the Metaxas Line. It was a spirit the German High Command had not factored into their precise, mathematical calculations for a swift victory. But while the forts themselves were proving to be an unbreakable wall of courage, the larger strategic battle was being lost hundreds of miles away. The German plan had always been a two-pronged assault. While the 12th Army was breaking itself against the Metaxas Line in the east, the German Second Army had simultaneously crashed into Yugoslavia from the north. The resistance in Yugoslavia, unlike in Greece, collapsed almost instantly. The country, torn by internal ethnic divisions, was not prepared for the speed and violence of the Blitzkrieg. The Yugoslav army disintegrated in a matter of days. This rapid victory opened up a strategic opportunity that the German command exploited with ruthless efficiency. The 2nd Panzer Division, one of the spearhead units of the Blitzkrieg, broke through the weak Yugoslav defenses, turned south, and began a lightning-fast drive down the Axios River Valley. This was the Achilles heel of the Greek defense. The Metaxas Line only covered the border with Bulgaria. It did not and could not cover the longer, more open border with Yugoslavia. The panzers were moving through the back door. By April 8th, while the garrisons of the Metaxas Line were still heroically repelling every attack. The tanks of the 2nd Panzer Division were racing towards the vital port city of Thessaloniki. The entire Greek Eastern Macedonia army section, the force that included all the defenders of the Metaxas Line, was about to be cut off from the rest of Greece. They were being encircled, not by a tactical maneuver, but by a grand strategic one. On April 9th, the news reached the commanders in the forts. Thessaloniki had fallen. The German panzers were now behind them, cutting their supply lines and their only route of retreat. For the soldiers in the tunnels of Fort Rupel and the other complexes, the news was incomprehensible. They had not been defeated. They had held their ground. They had inflicted crippling casualties on the enemy. They had watched elite German divisions break and retreat before their guns. By every measure of combat, they were victorious. Yet they were being told that the battle was lost. At 14 Sarnus on April 9th, General Konstantinos Bakopoulos received the order from the Greek High Command in Athens. To prevent a now pointless slaughter, he was to seek terms of capitulation. The anguish and disbelief among the Greek officers was immense. They had held the concrete wall against the world's most powerful army, only to be defeated by a map. The final act of the battle was one of the most remarkable displays of military chivalry in the entire war. The Germans, having failed to capture a single one of the major forts by force, sent envoys forward under a white flag to negotiate the surrender. When the German delegation arrived at Fort Rupel, they were met by its commander, Colonel Georgios Duratsos. The German officer, a colonel from the Gebirgsjäger, expressed his profound admiration for the courage and tenacity of the fort's defenders. The terms of surrender were agreed upon. The fighting would cease. The Greek soldiers would become prisoners of war. But what happened next was unprecedented. On the morning of April 10th, the surviving Greek soldiers of the Fort Rupel garrison marched out of their shattered, smoking fortress. They were not a defeated rabble. They marched in perfect formation, their rifles on their shoulders, their battle-torn flag flying proudly. As they emerged into the daylight, they were met not by guards and prison camps, but by the German soldiers they had been fighting for 4 days. On the order of the German commander, the German troops formed an honor guard. As the defeated Greek column marched past, the victors presented arms and gave a full military salute. The German commander strode up to Colonel Duratsos, shook his hand, and expressed his honor at having fought against such soldiers. He made no demand for the surrender of their flag. The defenders of Fort Rupel marched into captivity with their honor intact, having earned the ultimate respect of their enemy. This extraordinary gesture was repeated at several of the other surrendering forts. It was a profound acknowledgement by the German professional soldiers that they had been fought to a standstill and had only won through a strategic maneuver, not a tactical victory. The defenders of the Metaxas Line had lost the battle, but they had won a moral victory that would echo through the history of their nation. The story of the Battle of the Metaxas Line is a paradox. It is a story of a crushing strategic defeat, and at the same time, one of the most brilliant and successful tactical defenses of the entire war. The final numbers tell this story with stark clarity. In the 4 days of fighting along the fortress line, the Germans suffered heavy casualties, with some estimates placing their losses at over 8,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. The elite German mountain divisions that had been tasked with breaking the line were severely bloodied. In stark contrast, the Greek defenders, protected by their concrete and rock fortifications, sustained remarkably light casualties. The cost of their defiance, measured in blood, had been a fraction of that paid by the victors. This lopsided casualty ratio was the ultimate proof of the line's effectiveness. It had performed its function perfectly. It had been designed to bleed an invader, and it had done so with ruthless efficiency. The German command had made a fundamental error, one that was repeated by overconfident armies throughout history. They had mistaken a lack of resources for a lack of will. They saw a small nation, already exhausted by a long war with Italy, and assumed its army would crumble at the first sight of the swastika. Their intelligence reports had detailed the physical specifications of the forts, the thickness of the concrete, and the caliber of the guns. But they had no way to quantify the determination of the men inside. The Blitzkrieg doctrine was a weapon of both physical and psychological shock. It was designed to move so fast and strike so hard that the enemy's command structure and his will to fight would shatter. At the Metaxas Line, it failed. The physical shock was absorbed by the concrete, and the psychological shock was met with an unyielding wall of national pride. The Greek soldiers refused to panic, refused to break, and in doing so they exposed a critical flaw in the German war machine. It faltered when faced with an enemy that was not afraid to die. The Battle of the Metaxas Line also exposed the limitations of mechanized warfare in unsuitable terrain. The Panzers, the unstoppable iron cavalry of the Wehrmacht, were useless in the face of the mountain fortresses. They were confined to the narrow valleys, where they became easy targets for the Greek artillery. The battle had to be fought and won by the infantry, the Gebirgsjäger, in a primitive, close-quarters struggle for every pillbox and every yard of trench. The Greek engineers of the 1930s had correctly predicted the nature of a future invasion and had designed a system that perfectly negated the enemy's primary strength. They had channeled the Blitzkrieg into a meat grinder. Though the line was ultimately bypassed, its tactical success was a lesson in the timeless principles of defensive warfare. Use the terrain, protect your forces, and neutralize the enemy's advantages. But the most significant legacy of this heroic doomed defense was not tactical. It was strategic, and it would have consequences that would ripple across the world, ultimately reaching the gates of Moscow itself. The German plan for 1941 was centered on one colossal, history-altering event: Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The original start date for this invasion was planned for May 15th. However, the unexpected need to invade Yugoslavia and, crucially, the tenacious and time-consuming resistance put up by the Greeks forced the entire German timetable to be pushed back. The campaign in Greece did not end with the fall of the Metaxas Line. It continued for weeks as German forces fought British, Australian, and New Zealand troops in the south and hunted down Greek remnants. The campaign officially ended on April 30th. The divisions used in the Balkans, particularly the armoured and motorised units, then had to be refitted, repaired, and transported hundreds of miles to the staging grounds for the invasion of Russia. Because of this, the start of Operation Barbarossa was delayed by 5 critical weeks, from May 15th to June 22nd. Those 5 weeks were perhaps the most important of the entire war. When the German armies crashed into the Soviet Union, their advance was spectacular. But as autumn arrived, bringing with it the notorious Russian rains that turned the landscape into a sea of mud, the German offensive began to slow. By the time they reached the outskirts of Moscow in late November, the one enemy that no army in history has ever defeated had arrived: the Russian winter. Temperatures plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. Tank engines froze solid. Weapons ceased to function, and the German soldiers, still in their summer uniforms, began to freeze to death in their foxholes. The final assault on Moscow failed, just a few miles from the spires of the Kremlin. Historians will forever debate the exact impact of the Balkan delay, but the fact remains that those 5 weeks of spring and early summer, lost in the mountains of Greece, were 5 weeks the German army desperately needed in front of Moscow. The soldiers of the Metaxas Line, in their hopeless, heroic last stand, had given the Soviet Union the one thing it needed more than anything else: time. They had helped to buy the winter that would save Moscow and ultimately doom the Third Reich. The story of Greek resistance became a beacon of hope in a Europe that was shrouded in the darkness of Nazi occupation. At a time when the world had seen nothing but German victories, the small nation of Greece had been the first to decisively defeat an Axis army, humiliating Mussolini in Albania. Then, when the full might of the German war machine was turned against them, they did not collapse. They fought with a courage that won the admiration of the world. Winston Churchill, in a famous speech, captured this sentiment, stating, "Henceforth we will not say that Greeks fight like heroes, but that heroes fight like Greeks." The defense of the Metaxas Line was the ultimate expression of this spirit. In the final analysis, the concrete wall that the German army encountered was not just made of reinforced concrete and steel. It was built upon a foundation of human will. The physical fortifications were the skeleton, but the flesh and blood of the defense was the unbreakable spirit of the Greek soldiers who manned them. They knew they were likely doomed. They knew that their small country could not hope to stand against the full power of the German Reich. But they made a collective decision to fight anyway, to defend their land to the last man and the last bullet, and to inflict a price on the invader that he would never forget. They lost their battle. Their country was occupied, but their sacrifice was not in vain. The story of their defiance, epitomized by the German honor guard saluting the vanquished heroes of Fort Rupel, is a timeless lesson. It is a testament to the fact that even in the face of certain defeat, there is victory to be found in courage. It proves that a last stand is never pointless if it buys time, inspires others, and earns the respect of history. The German army came to Greece expecting a swift victory. Instead, on the slopes of the Metaxas Line, they were given a brutal lesson in the true meaning of the word no. The respect that the German soldiers showed to the surrendering Greek garrisons was not a spontaneous gesture. It was an acknowledgement of a shared experience as professional soldiers. The Germans, particularly the Gebirgsjäger, saw in the Greek defenders a reflection of their own warrior ethos. They respected the Greeks' skill, their bravery, and their refusal to break under unimaginable pressure. The German commander of the Setu 8th Mountain Corps, General Franz Böhmer, was so impressed by the Greek resistance that in his official report, he wrote that the Greek soldier had fought with the highest contempt for death. The final scene at Fort Rupel, with the German honor guard saluting the defeated garrison, was a moment of profound, shared humanity in the midst of an inhuman war. It was an admission from the victors that their victory had been a hollow one, achieved by a map, not by force of arms. They had bypassed the wall, but they had failed to break the men who had built it. The Greek soldiers had lost their forts, but they had won the battle for respect. They had proven to the world and to their enemies that the strength of a nation is not measured in the number of its tanks, but in the courage of its people.